There are new developments regarding a 2021 story out of Canada. At the time, reports said there were mass graves of Indigenous children found at residential schools in the North American country. Some of those schools were run by the Catholic Church. According to a new report, the recent excavation of 14 alleged burial sites unearthed no human remains. We go now to Colm Flynn, EWTN News Vatican Correspondent. Colm, great to be with you. First off, can you tell us more about these new developments in the story that we just mentioned?
A very good evening, Tracy. Yes, indeed, I can. Well, 2 years ago, after stories dominated the headlines around the world about alleged mass graves of Indigenous children at former residential schools right across Canada, it is now believed that the stories of these mass graves could be false after excavations have turned up no human remains. And you'll remember Pope Francis, he travelled to Canada last year, and indeed I went on that trip with the Holy Father. We reported on it extensively here on EWTN. There in Canada, the Pope apologised for the Church's role in the residential school system and the reported abuse of many of its members. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau demanded that the Vatican apologise for its role in the scandal in relation to the mass graves. Well, 2 years after the original stories of the mass graves broke, a series of recent excavations at suspected sites has turned up no human remains. Now, this has led many academics and politicians to say it's further evidence that the stories are unproven. A group of Indigenous people, also known as Pine Creek First Nation, they excavated 14 sites in the basement of Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows Catholic Church. That's near the Pine Creek Residential School during a 4-week period this summer. And eventually, the chief of the group, Derek Piniak, he went on record, held a press conference and said that no remains were found.
So, Colm, what's been the reaction around the world to these new revelations?
Well, sadly, Tracy, there hasn't been much coverage of this update of the story, especially when you compare it to the coverage of the original story that there were mass graves. If anyone at home now Googles Mass Graves Canada, you'll find thousands of results of networks and outlets reporting on the suspected mass graves, some even putting estimated numbers on the amount of children supposedly buried. And this story, Tracy, was covered all over the world on TV, radio, in all newspapers, reported as fact, by the way, in many cases. For example, at the time, the BBC interviewed an Indigenous chief who said that the residential school policy was, quote, designed to kill, and we're seeing proof of that, end quote. There was never any proof, and statements like this went unchallenged. And in Canada, there was a 260% rise in Catholic hate crimes. Churches were burnt down, priests and nuns suffered abuse on the streets, and online there was a huge amount of abusive posts towards the church. But, Tracy, if you search for the recent update of the story that excavations have been carried out and so far no human remains have been found, you'll see that only a few outlets seem to have picked up on the story. One of the voices responding to the news is Jacques Rolliard. He is a professor emerite in the Department of History at the University of Montreal, and he said, quote, I don't like to use the word hoax because it's very strong, but there are just too many falsehoods circulating about this issue with no real evidence. He went on to say too much was said and decided upon before there was ever any proof, end quote.
Yeah, definitely more questions than answers on this right now. Colm, take us back to 2021. I mean, how did the allegations come to light in the first place? And also, what was the reaction? I mean, you mentioned some of it, but what really was the reaction at the time?
Well, there was, in May 2021, that's when the first stories come out. It was another Indigenous group. They claimed that they had made a shocking discovery of mass graves of around 200 Indigenous children. They were using ground-penetrating radar at a residential school in British Columbia. They named these children, they even put a name on the children, their group called The Missing. Now, the radar found what are labelled anomalies in the soil, but there was never any proof of actual human remains. But the story, like I said, was picked up. It spread like wildfire across the world, reported, again, as I said, as fact in many places, especially on social media, where people were outraged. And there was this image portrayed of the residential schools and the people who work there, namely Catholic priests and nuns. The outrage, in fact, was so high-pitched that a former Canadian Attorney General called James McRae, he had to resign from a government panel just because he was sceptical at the time of the claim about these mass graves in the first place. He said, quote, "The evidence does not support the overall gruesome narrative put forward around the world for several years, a narrative for which verifiable evidence is scarce and even non-existent," end quote. He was forced to step down because of that. Now, it's important, Tracy, to point out that there still are a number of other alleged sites of mass graves that have not been excavated, and there's no set dates to work on these sites. And we do know from speaking to many Indigenous former residents of the school, some even who I spoke to when I was there, who told me of a system where children were separated from their families for extended periods of time. There was assimilation, meaning that they were not allowed to learn about their Indigenous culture or history. They weren't allowed to speak their Indigenous language, and so on and so forth. But then again, Tracy, when I was there and we saw it in our reports on EWTN at the time, there were other Indigenous people I spoke to who had warm, fond memories of their time in these residential schools and spoke about the nuns and the priests that they encounter. In fact, one Indigenous man I remember speaking to, he told me that he couldn't understand the claims that would be made by others, again, because of his warm memories of being in these schools. But at the moment, Tracy, that is the update on this story. We'll continue to monitor it as it develops. But for just now, it's Colm Flynn here in Rome.